In my last video on the Fairy Phantom, I talked about how it was pretty much the end of the line of the biplane designs by that point. Sure, there were a few later examples, and quite a few served in a number of conflicts, including the Second World War, often with a fair bit of success. Because though we can look back now to the mid 1930s and say that was the point where the change really happened, and the biplanes were now largely yesterday's news, that wasn't obvious at the time. Though the biplanes suffered performance-wise against the monoplanes, they did have a number of advantages over their single-winged counterparts that quite a lot of experts at the time thought might mean that the biplane was still the correct design choice. Heck, I've covered a fair number of them myself. Probably the most extreme example is the Canadian Car and Foundry's FDB-1, a biplane fighter that first flew as late as 1938. And the Italians, who built biplane fighters up until 1942, actually went to the extent of sticking a DB601 engine in one of their CR-42s to see if the improved performance would give the biplane a new lease on frontline life. Spoiler alert, it didn't. This persistence in trying to keep the biplane relevant came down to the fact that that type of aircraft did offer something that users often wanted, but which monoplanes could struggle with: lots of lift. This often showed itself in improved manoeuvrability, but more importantly, that lift generated by their extra wing meant that they could often land and take off on much shorter runways. And the bonuses that the extra wing conferred shouldn't be written off, because a lot of effort went into seeing if aircraft could be built that combined the best of both worlds, the biplane's lift with the monoplane's performance. In Britain, they created the Hilson FH40 slip-wing Hurricane. This fitted a jettisonable top wing to a Hawker Hurricane, with the initial idea being that it would enable interceptors to climb up to altitude as fast as possible, with the wing being detached once at height so that the aircraft could revert to its original monoplane form and maximise its fighting performance. Even more extreme was the Nikitin-Shevchenko polymorphic fighters. Yes, I said polymorphic. The aircraft would literally transform in flight between biplane and monoplane to suit the requirements of the pilot. As I mentioned, all of these aircraft I have covered in the past, and I shall put links in those little pop-up boxes that appear in the last 8 seconds of my videos. The thing is, these aircraft were all quite late in the day, all being developed between 1938 and 1943, where the monoplane was basically recognised as the undisputed king of the fighter field. But imagine the angst of fighter designers and procurers in the early to mid 1930s. Then people were getting excited about the possibilities of the new monoplanes that were in development, but biplanes were the standard, and there was far less certainty that monos wouldn't prove a white elephant in the long run. So, if you are an aircraft corporation at that time wondering which course to take, what do? Well, in the case of aviation giant Curtiss, you hedge. Meet the XF13C, an aircraft designed to allow the user to switch it between mono and biplane configurations. Throughout the 1920s, it wasn't unusual for the US Navy to have two variants of the aircraft they ordered built for it, one for operation off the fleet's carriers, the other generally being heavier and more powerful with better performance for use from shore bases and with the US Marine Corps squadrons. The Vought 03U/SU series Corsairs being a good example of this practice. In the early 1930s, the Navy began to pay attention to the potential of the monoplane. The problem was the long takeoff and landing characteristics of these in comparison to biplanes meant that there were some doubts as to whether they could operate successfully off of a carrier deck. Curtiss's suggestion to resolve this conundrum was to build an aircraft that could be both, depending on what you needed it for, designating the aircraft as the Model 70 in their company system. In November 1932, the US Navy ordered examples to examine the principle, in turn issuing new designations: XF13C-1 for the monoplane configuration and XF13C-2 for the biplane. Sources are rather scant on this aircraft, but I believe only a single one was actually built, being used for most of its existence in the monoplane configuration. The XF13C first flew in December 1933 in biplane configuration before repeating the process in January the following year as a monoplane, then being delivered to the Navy in February for testing. Engined with the Wright 1510 double-row radial that produced 600 horsepower, the aircraft had a number of advanced features for the day. Built primarily of metal, the XF13C was constructed as a semi-monocoque design, with fabric only used to skin the wings. In addition to that, it had a fully enclosed cockpit and a manually retractable landing gear, as well as being fitted with leading edge slats and trailing edge flaps. The aircraft was essentially a parasol wing design, with the primary fixed wing being located in line with the top of the cockpit canopy. In its dual wing configuration, the second, much smaller wing was fitted in line with the bottom of the fuselage, technically making the aircraft a sesquiplane. Armament is listed as being a single 50 caliber Browning heavy machine gun and one 30 caliber one, though as this was an experimental design, I suspect these were not fitted. The US Navy tested the aircraft for the next year before returning it to Curtiss, requesting a couple of changes. Principally the fitting of an improved variant of the Wright engine that produced 700 horsepower and a smaller tail so that the aircraft could be handled more easily aboard carriers. With these alterations, the aircraft was once again sent for naval testing, now with the designation of XF13C-3. The conclusions were that the different configurations did what they were supposed to, with the final variant in monoplane configuration having a top listed speed of 232 miles per hour, while when fitted with its bottom wing, top speed was around 213 miles per hour. But when the extra wings were fitted, the aircraft demonstrated superior takeoff landing capabilities and low speed handling. Again, not really a surprise. What I would like to know, and have found no reference to, is how quickly the aircraft's configurations could be changed. Did it take an hour, a day, a week? And could this switch be made aboard a carrier or at a forward operating base? Or did it require proper mechanical workshops to be undertaken? As I said, I don't know. If anyone does, please let us know in the comments because I would be really interested to find out. Whatever, the Navy ultimately concluded that the concept wasn't really necessary, and by October 1935, trials were terminated. Apparently, the aircraft saw some use in further experimental work after this with the NACA, but again, sources are scant. So the XF-13C vanished into obscurity. Another interesting experimental idea that ultimately proved an aviation dead end.